The Trump administration followed through today on its threat, and it announced it is pulling the United States out of a key armed controls agreement with Russia. The U.S. is withdrawing from the Agreement on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or the INF. The 1987 agreement covers ground-launched cruise missiles with a range of up to 5,500 kilometers. Now, the move is worrisome to all those who are concerned by nuclear proliferation and the risk of nuclear war. The Trump administration says it's withdrawing because of repeated violations of the agreement by Russia. Russia warns that the move will lead to the resumption of the arms race. I'm joined now by Paul Meyer. From 2003 to 2007, he served as Canada's permanent ambassador and representative to the UN Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. Mr. Meyer, thank you very much for taking the time.
Fine, happy to speak to you.
Okay, well, I guess the first question is, what should we make of this announcement? It's not new, we saw it coming, but the Trump administration has followed through on it. What should we make of it?
Well, regrettably, I think it's a very troubling development because it suggests a further dismantlement of the legally binding framework of strategic restraint between these two leading nuclear powers. And I remind all that Russia and the United States, between them, possess something like 90% of all the nuclear weapons in the world.
What remains? Because this is one agreement in a series, and without getting too technical, but for example, I think there's a longer range interballistic missile ICBM limit. How much of the actual agreements on nuclear weapons does this affect?
Well, it's the implication, I think, is that it sets up a situation where the United States is likely not to agree to an extension of the 2010 so-called New START treaty, which is the principal arms control treaty extant between Russia and the United States. It limits to 1,550 the number of deployed warheads. And that treaty is set to expire in February of 2021, unless it is extended. There is a provision in the treaty to have it extended for a further 5 years, and all that requires is that the two sides agree to such an extension. But the U.S. seems to be dragging its feet on this now, and clearly can use the sort of compliance problem that they claim the INF treaty is being violated as a sort of rationale for not continuing in this strategic constraint regime with Russia. And if that treaty expires, in fact, that there would no longer be any legal constraints on the nuclear arsenals of those two powers. And all of the very extensive verification regime, which did exist under this New START agreement, would also disappear. So it would be just a complete freedom of action for both parties. And with obviously the troubling and deteriorating geopolitical climate, I think that would be a very problematic situation for global security.
If we try and make heads or tails of what has happened, what do you make of the American accusations? They say that Russia has been deploying intermediate range nuclear weapons against the spirit and against the detail of this agreement, that they've been violating the agreement. What do you make of their accusations?
Well, it's a little difficult for those outside government circles to ascertain the credibility of the claims because no evidence has been made public. That said, and just a small correction, the INF treaty governs ground-based
cruise missiles, right? Okay.
Well, all forms of ballistic missiles, as well as so-called cruise missiles, in the range from 500 to 5,000 500 kilometers. And that was the landmark agreement that in 1987 that eliminated this whole category of nuclear forces, which were particularly destabilizing because they were forward deployed in Europe, and therefore the sort of flight time to Moscow was measured in a matter of 10 to 12 minutes, rather than the 30 minutes that an ICBM from North America would take. So it was a very destabilizing situation. Your older listeners may recall the tensions around the deployments in Germany at that time, and this was one of the really important achievements of the Cold War period, and helped bring in other important arms control agreements thereafter. So alas, we seem to be going back to a situation of Cold War tensions. This one system doesn't really represent a military threat to the United States and its allies' nuclear deterrent. There are many other systems, both sea-based and air-based, plus, of course, ICBMs that could hold Russian targets in furtherance of a nuclear deterrent posture. So there really isn't a military rationale here for, let's say, additional deployments of ground-based rockets by the United States, though the Trump administration is suggesting that that might be one of the options they refer to. And it's just, again, adding a new spiral in a nuclear arms race that seems to be reemerging, alas, once again, with major modernization programs on nuclear forces being undertaken by all the nuclear weapon states.
What about some people, and now I don't know whether this is well-founded, but some people have suggested that what also might be behind this decision is that there is an issue of China, and that China is ready or deploying missile defenses at its borders as it develops its missile technology. It's not covered by this IMF agreement, and some people have suggested that this is, by opting out of this would allow the U.S. to be freer to deploy medium-range missiles against China, or to increase its numbers to counter China's growth of missile defense. Do you see that as anywhere part of the possible calculation?
Yeah, it's not Chinese missile defenses. It's Chinese missiles that have an offensive capability. And it's true that they have not been part of this restraint regime, which was set up between what were and still are the two leading nuclear powers. I find this an implausible sort of rationale, in that, again, there are many other systems that are available to the United States in terms of countering the more limited nuclear forces of China, and that remains the same. Plus, there are political problems if indeed the United States was to try to develop and deploy in Asia ground-based missiles within the prohibitive range, because you'd come into the basing issues. Where would they have to go? Into countries presumably like Japan and South Korea. And those publics, I think, would be quite alarmed and resistant to having those sorts of nuclear forces actually deployed on their territory.
So if if this is as you say, then I mean, this sort of inexorable march towards a re-escalation of a potential arms race, and a march towards maybe not ratifying the 2011 re-ratifying the New START agreements. If this is all happening and they're marching towards it, what does the rest of the world do faced with this? What are our options? What do we, like in Canada, what do we do?
Well, I think first we should be heard on this issue. We should speak up. The Canadian government hasn't issued any statements relating to the deterioration of the nuclear arms control regime, and I think it's time they do so. Just a few days ago, a group of eminent Canadians, recipients of the Order of Canada, sent a letter to the Prime Minister appealing to him to speak out in support of maintaining the nuclear arms control regime and to ensure that Canada was seen to be a proponent of a continued restraint. I mean, that's not to say that the compliance issue should not be dealt with, and there are specific mechanisms under the INF Treaty for the two sides to work these things out. It seems more that there's been a lack of political will to see the sort of technical fixes that could come about. I mean, just to give you an example, there would be suggestions that there would be mutual inspections of the systems in question. You should know that the Russians have claimed that the ballistic missile defense interceptors, the so-called Aegis Shore, that the U.S. has deployed in Romania and plans to deploy in Poland, that those interceptor missiles could also be used to launch missiles in the prohibited range. So it would seem that the one promising technical resolution would be to allow mutual inspections so that U.S. inspectors could get a better assessment of the actual range of the ground-based system in dispute here, the Russian ground-based system, and the Russians could have their concerns allayed that the ballistic missile defense systems being deployed in Europe are in fact not containing offensive missiles. So I think there would be a way forward, and I hope that there are voices in allied capitals and elsewhere that will speak up on this and urge a continued commitment to the sorts of restraints we have. Because ultimately it is in no one's interest to see this restraint regime just collapse and to give a new impetus to nuclear arms racing.
Okay, well, Paul Meyer, I want to thank you very much for taking the time. We will watch this with interest and cross our fingers that we can be optimistic about it. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you, Martin.